Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to the Embrace Mental Health podcast,
where we embrace a not-so-clinical approach
to conversations surrounding all things mental health.
Hello, and welcome to the Embrace Mental Health podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey, and today I've got with me Wesley.
Hi Wesley. Good to be here.
Today our topic is tips for finding a therapist. But before we get into that, we'll start with our intro question, which is kind of a fun one today. And I will say, we have actually identified our biggest fan because this question comes from we're going to call her our biggest fan because she's the first one to submit a question. So Stacy, congratulations, you are our biggest fan. And if you want to be like Stacy and be one of our biggest fans, submit some questions for us. So the question for today is, if you were a color, what color would you be? Wes, you go first.
Okay. Well, hopefully I'm not going to take yours. I would have to say blue. And specifically kind of a light blue.
Okay.
I just feel like, to me, I've been told by people that I help them feel more at peace and calm. And to me, that is kind of the calmest color. Even though blue is probably the coolest color on the color spectrum, I think that there's kind of a warmth to like a soft light blue, not necessarily lavender blue, but you know what I mean? Kind of like a sky blue, I guess. So
yeah.
Yeah, and I guess maybe that's why I like it too. It's kind of like a clear blue sky, very open, very broad. That's me.
Yeah. You did not steal mine, so good job. My favorite color, I mean, it's a little ironic. It's probably pretty dang close to the sweatshirt I'm wearing and my wall behind me. But I think the color I would be a teal, so like a little bit more blue mixed into the color that I'm wearing and the color of my wall, which for our audio people is a seafoam green, kind of, I would say is what this is. But anyway.
Yeah, kind of a darker seafoam green, sure.
So a nice teal color, specifically maybe the color of water for our Michigan people, like Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, like that aquamarine color of when the sun is shining on the water. My name actually has to do with some of the like nautical, it's like of the sea or from the ship island, or, you know, depending which Google search you go by. But I've always been pretty drawn to water and to the beach and to bigger lakes and waves. And something that I've always kind of connected with in that is that in some ways I think water, like the ocean, never stays the same, but it also never truly moves. It's kind of one of those weird things where it's always moving, but at the same time, it's always in the same place. And there's something about that has always kind of felt a little bit of a connection to me, where there's some things in me that are constant, but there are also some things in me that are always moving and always shifting. And so, yeah, felt like that was like a little pretentious, but I'm all right. I don't know.
Good answer. That's okay. You know, if you're going to answer that question, you answer it.
That's right. You answer it. So yeah. All right. So as I discussed a month ago at the beginning of November, we're to December now, which is kind of wild. The years keep coming and they don't stop coming, or what? What is the...
That's it. That's a perfect Smash Mouth quote.
Perfect Smash Mouth, yes.
Something through the roof and I hit the ground running.
Yep. So this is our first episode for the month of December. And so as I had talked about before, the first episode of every month for this season anyway, we are going to discuss therapy-related topics. And so we kind of covered Therapy 101 about a month ago. And so now we're going into the topic of tips for finding a therapist. So kind of... you might see a little bit of progression in how our topics go. But yeah, so Wesley and I have each come up with a few tips for how to find a therapist that's a good fit for you. So, Wes, I'm going to make you go first again.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Well, my first tip is a resource that lots of people know about, but a surprising number of people do not know about. And when I share it with them, they're like, oh my word, are you kidding me? This actually exists. I can't believe that I've been frantic over trying to find the right therapist. And that is therapist directories. There are a lot of fantastic online therapist directories out there. And so the biggest one is psychologytoday.com. There are so many thousands and thousands of different types of therapists listed on there. And one thing that I like about all of these directories, and maybe especially Psychology Today, is the fact that there are so many therapists listed on it, and yet the filters are so powerful that it's not too hard to find somebody or to find multiple options that could be a good fit for you. So my go-to when I'm referring someone to a therapist or to a different therapist is to hop on psychologytoday.com. And at first I would get the person's insurance information if they want to use insurance and get an idea of what mental health issues they want to work on. And of course, where they're located if they want to see someone in person. And you can very easily put that information into Psychology Today. And so at first you might have a list of like 50 or 60 therapists in your area. And then as you filter down, you might get down to 10 or so. And then from there, I just like to kind of open in new tabs, the ones that seem like they would be a good fit. I might do all 10 of them if there are 10. And I can look at what they say their specialties are or what they have experience in. I can look at their description and kind of get an overall vibe of the person or what their focuses and priorities are. And then I like to send the person anywhere from 2 to 4 options to choose from. I think it's good to have more than one option, but not an overwhelming number. So Psychology Today is a great one. Goodtherapy.org is a great alternative. And then one that I'm on all 3 of these because I think as a therapist, it just makes sense to be on these things because the exposure that you get to the community for the relatively low cost that it takes to kind of enter into it is kind of a no-brainer. But I had never heard of this one before until I got on it myself. This one's called ZocDoc. And it's not just for doctors, physicians, it's for all kinds of clinical professionals, including therapists. And one cool thing about ZocDoc is that they offer, you can book right there on the website. They have this feature where, so in my case, as a therapist, it syncs with my Google Calendar, as does my therapy schedule. Syncs with my Google Calendar. And so ZocDoc can basically see when I have openings. And right there on the website, somebody can pretty much just book themselves. And I have it set up so that they're just booked for a consultation call, and then I kind of take it from there. But for some therapists out there, you can just say, this is when my intake session is going to be. I don't have to talk to anybody else about it and just kind of show up. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So there's other benefits to that too. So that would be my first one is check out these directories. It's a great place to start.
Yeah. I that's interesting about ZocDoc. I haven't heard of that one. Definitely the one that I've used the most would be the Psychology Today one, and I actually even have it open up on my screen over here. And so some of the ways that you can filter it, so it has like what issues you want to talk about. It has insurance info on it. It has gender, types of therapy, age, price, and more. But, that can really help you. Because like Wesley said, it can be intimidating when you're like, oh my gosh, there's literally 1,000 results. How am I supposed to figure out which one's best for me? Well, that one helps you kind of narrow it down to a little bit more precisely what you're looking for. So Psychology Today is definitely one that I've used. But I like that aspect of ZocDoc because I think it's a pretty common millennial, and I would also guess Gen Z problem that we hate making phone calls. I can't tell you how many times just simply making a phone call has deterred me from doing something. And so a lot of times, if ZocDoc has it so that you can just kind of get through there without having to make a phone call, that can make it more accessible for some people who have some anxieties around that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yep. And one more thing I want to say, because you pointed out about Psychology Today, and again, I think that other directories have this too, and there are more than these 3 out there, but I would say these are the 3 biggest names that I am aware of, is that you can filter by some demographics too, and that's a very serious issue for a lot of people seeking therapy. They want somebody who is a Black, Indigenous, person of color, or somebody who is of a certain age, be that younger or older, somebody from the LGBTQ plus community. Yeah. So those are legitimate concerns, and I'm glad that Psychology Today and other directories can address those.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So for my first tip, I have to kind of figure out what your goals are in terms of addressing therapy. Sometimes, when you're doing that search, if you're not really narrowed it down to what it is exactly you're looking for, it can be hard to figure out what it is you're looking for or who it is you're looking for. So, just taking some time to do some reflection of, okay, what are the top 3 things maybe that you want to address with a therapist? Whether it's managing your stress better, current things that you're currently dealing with. For some people, you might want to look into working through some stuff in your childhood or working through past traumas. Some of it can literally just be sleeping better. Just kind of figuring out what are the top 3 things that you would like to address with a therapist or a counselor. And, so then as you're looking through the different biographies or looking, at different options, you can kind of see which ones line up best with what it is that you're wanting to address.
And to add on to that, that's going to be really helpful for your therapist when you get into therapy, because I've had clients come in and say like, well, the main thing is I just want somebody kind of non-biased, non-judgmental to talk to. And that can be, don't get me wrong, that can be extremely valuable. But to really take it to the next level, it can be helpful to say, here's the stuff that I want to work on. Here are the areas where I want to grow to improve my mental health. And that way your therapist can, they're going to put together some kind of a care plan for how we're actually going to accomplish this. So you'll probably see more significant positive change in your life if you have goals ahead of time in mind.
And it's not one of those things where you have to sit down and spend hours upon hours figuring it out, but just kind of coming up with a general idea. And it's always helpful to take some time for some personal reflection on what are some of the things that I'm experiencing that aren't working for me, to kind of put it in a framework that we've used before. And kind of go from there. It doesn't have to be exhaustive, but at the same time, just spending a little bit of time kind of taking that time for some self-reflection can be helpful and maybe prevent you from having to make too many changes or having too many, going down too many wrong paths. But
Yeah, make the most of your time.
Yeah.
My next tip is that if you find that the directories aren't working for you for some reason, and this is especially true if you have a pretty specific type of insurance that you want to use. I know, at least here in Michigan, sometimes people have Medicaid through some other insurance company, like Medicaid through Meridian or Molina or HAP or whoever else. And it can be a little bit tricky when you have a situation like that, or if you have a specific type of insurance through your work that is just really kind of niche. And if you're set on using insurance to pay for therapy, it can be kind of frustrating to find somebody through one of those directories or just by kind of calling around. And so something that a lot of people don't realize they can do is you can call your insurance company, and you probably have some kind of customer service number on the back of your insurance card that you can call, and you can have them make a referral to you for somebody who they will pay for your therapy sessions, or maybe you'll have a copay, whatever your situation is. But they will make a referral to somebody who they have listed as someone who they cover sessions for. I don't know if I said that exactly right, but yeah, so that's just another way to find someone effectively. The reason that I'm focusing on these kinds of things is that I know from personal experience and from talking to clients that finding a therapist who's a good fit can be a huge pain in the neck. And if you can find someone who's a good fit on your first or second try, as opposed to your fifth or sixth plus try, it's going to greatly decrease your frustration. And I would say even more importantly, make it more likely that you're going to actually follow through and, again, start doing this work in therapy. So it's critical. So I think that between these directories and calling your insurance company, and of course, if you have someone who can just recommend you, word of mouth is obviously one of the best referrals that you can get from somebody who you know and trust. But between all of those kinds of resources, hopefully you can get it within the first 1, 2, 3 tries at least.
Yeah, that is interesting. Especially if you have kind of one of those trickier insurances that isn't maybe as common of one, that doesn't cover as much, or is just, can be kind of confusing. That's great to know that you can call them and put the onus on them to figure out their own.
That's right. Yeah, you have a whole list.
Yeah.
Or an employee assistance program. Not to take that for granted. Sometimes for your employer, that might be the person who you go through, or the payer that you go through.
Yeah, do as much as you can to kind of relieve some of the headache that can be. My second tip, it's sort of related to what Wesley was just talking about, but one of the best things that's worked for me and my friend group is we help each other find therapists. A lot of times when you're kind of in that space of wanting to start therapy, you're going through some stressful situations, or you just don't feel like you have a lot of extra capacity to do a bunch of research or spend all this extra energy trying to do all the kind of logistical work that goes into finding a therapist. And so what my friend group and I have done is we kind of get an idea of what it is the person is looking for. And then somebody who might be in a little bit of a better mental health space then kind of does the logistical work in order to kind of look up a therapist. So for instance, my therapist that I am seeing, Wesley's wife actually was the one who found her for me. She went on to, I'm pretty sure it was psychology.com. I told her what my insurance was. I told her, a couple of the things that I was looking for, and she sent me a list of 3. And it's much easier to look through a list of 3 than it is to just start from scratch and try to figure all this out. And so after looking at the 3, I was like, I think this one will probably be the best fit. And that was what worked for me. So shout out to Marissa. That was awesome. I'm pretty sure I've found therapists for a couple who I consider my best friends, helped them find some good fits. And I think they both had good experiences with it too. And just, anything that you can do to kind of take some of the extra stuff that you have a hard time having follow through with, if you can kind of outsource that, to people who you trust and who you love and who you know, that was a huge thing for me, because if I had had to do that on my own, it probably would have taken me a little bit longer to get into therapy, and I might have dragged my feet a little bit more. But because they were able to do some of that work on my behalf, it kind of sped up the process a little bit. So, yeah.
That's great. And on the other side of that, if you want to have a very practical, serious way to support someone who's struggling in any way with their mental health, you can offer to do something like that. Okay. And tip number 3 for me, and by the way, Kelsey, I have kind of a bonus one that has to do with groups that I want to share at the end too. But my third one for individual therapy in particular, although this could apply for searching for a group as well, is to listen to your intuition as you research. I think that intuition is greatly underestimated by a lot of people who I know. And really, I think one of the best ways to think about intuition is it's basically your brain taking a whole bunch of knowledge that it's amassed over your life and taking shortcuts to help you understand something on a level that you may not even be able to put into words. And so if you're reading kind of a bio for a therapist on their website or on a directory like we talked about or something like that, and it's just like, this person seems like they're a little bit too kind of woo-woo for me, or maybe a little bit too like focused on assessments and prescriptive kind of approach, or whatever it is, then just X out of that tab and find somebody else. Unless you're in, like, you really want to find somebody in your area and you're in a rural area, your options may be more limited. I think that's important to keep in mind. And again, if you're not open to telehealth. But anyway, listen to your intuition. When I was seeking for a therapist a few years ago, there was somebody who it's like, I came across his Psychology Today profile and I read through it, and it started with a quote from the Sufi poet Rumi. And I was just like, this is the one. and of course I read the rest of the bio just to confirm that. And it totally did. It's like, this guy is my therapy soulmate. So, and actually to go back to our earlier discussion, they didn't end up taking my employee assistance program that would have paid for the therapy sessions. And then I ended up figuring out my issue in a completely unrelated way. I didn't end up seeing him. I would have liked to. But anyway, that just is one example of, just kind of pick up a general vibe from somebody. You don't even necessarily need to be able to put into words why you like them, why you're drawn to them, but to trust that intuition. And I think that more often than not, it's probably going to lead you the right direction.
Yeah. I think that is one of the things that's helpful about the directories too, is it does kind of give you a bio. So you do have a little bit better of an idea of who it is that you're getting connected with. Because one of my bad experiences with therapy, I had seen somebody else just kind of recommend this general company. And so I asked to see a therapist at this place, but I didn't really have a specific therapist in mind. And so they just matched me with somebody. And I mean, sometimes that works. But this particular time, I didn't really know anything about her before and going into it. And it just wasn't a good fit. It wasn't the right match. And so not to say that it could never be the right match because there was other times where I went in blind, so to speak, a blind date with my therapist, and it worked really well. So I think, like you said, having that directory to kind of look through gives it the space for your intuition to do some of the work ahead of time. And I mean, if you have a different way and it just seems easier to you to just go to a general practicing place and you don't want to look through all the bios and that just feels like it's too much for you, then trust that to intuition too. There's all kinds of intuition, but that's one of the things that I like about the Psychology Today is that they do have that piece of where you can read people's bios and you can tell sometimes you can just tell from a written paragraph whether you'll vibe with somebody or not. So
yeah, it might take 10 seconds.
Right.
And if not, then I'm not on Tinder, so I don't know if it's swipe left or swipe right, but you move on to the next one.
Left. It's left.
It's left. Okay.
Yeah. Swipe left.
Yep. There's an app idea for somebody out there. Tinder for therapists.
There you go. That would be not online dating, but an app that would be less fruitless
Therapy
than
Tinder,
online
we
dating.
can call it. Yeah, Thinder.
Oh, gosh. There we go. That'll be our next t-shirt is we'll just have a Thinder shirt.
Yeah. Are you on Thinder?
Yeah. All right. So that brings me to my next tip. And my next tip is just do it. I honestly, pretty much every time that I've gone to see a therapist, I think I said, my 6. I've seen 6 different therapists throughout my life. And every single time, the hardest part for me about therapy was starting. Once I got through the logistics, once I got through the intake process, once I got through all of that, then I generally really enjoyed the therapy. But one of the biggest humps is just getting over that initial piece. And so, I think that was partially why I asked friends to help me, was because I knew that it was going to take me longer and I was going to do more stalling if it was all up to me. But the more that you can just do it, don't dawdle, don't think too much about it. The reality is what's it going to hurt? If you see a therapist that, I don't know, I guess in a really bad therapist situation, you might get more trauma from your therapist, but that would be a pretty unlikely situation. And I think, sometimes people are afraid of what they don't know. We've, hopefully helped get some of those unknowns out of the way through this podcast. But I think it's just a general sense of fear of if I start kind of opening up this box that I've tried to keep shut for a long time, am I just going to lose all control? And the reality is, a good therapist, which not even a great therapist, but a good therapist understands that, you're going to be able to take it at your own pace. They will let you guide your own journey. And so if you need to take it just a tiptoe at a time, that's okay. But a tiptoe at a time is still faster than completely refusing to go down that road at all. So just do it.
You got forward motion. Along with that, let me echo something that Autumn said in the last episode about how she had to go through quite a few doctors to find somebody who she was really comfortable with. It's okay to admit, and I'm in the mental health field, to be able to admit that there's probably a lot of therapists out there who are not going to be a very good fit for you. Mm-hmm. And honestly, there's a sad number of therapists out there who are not good therapists for most people. I mean, I've got to be honest. And I mean, it's very similar for doctors. I think that we've all probably had or known somebody who's had a bad experience with doctors. Does that mean that doctors as a profession are not trustworthy, are not people who we should go to? I would say absolutely not. And the same is true for therapists. And so, Autumn said that she felt kind of gaslit by some of her doctors. And I've had clients say the same thing about therapists sometimes. Yeah. And so, again, I am hopeful that it's not the majority of therapists who would actually do more harm than good, but you might actually run into that. And that person could lose their license if that's your experience. It's not supposed to happen that way, but in the real world it does. And so it's okay to admit that either they're a bad therapist or more likely they're just not a great fit for you. And it's not your fault. It's not that therapy can't work for you. It's just that you might need to give it a couple more swings.
Yeah. I think too, if you have had negative experiences in therapy or you tried a couple and it just wasn't what you were hoping for, be willing to be open about that with a new therapist that you're trying out.
Yes.
As you're sending that intake, say, hey, I've had a couple bad experiences, so I'm willing to try again, or I'm trying to be willing to try again, but I've had some bad experiences. And the more open and honest you can be about where you're at, whether it's within your action, the issue you're wanting to address, or simply just having a difficult time. I've had to switch medical doctors for very similar reasons to Autumn. And one of the first things that I led with is, I have trauma history, and I need to know that you're willing to work with that. And if that's not something that you want to deal with, just let me know right now, and we won't even, bother. And so I'll just kind of look for that next name. The more awareness that you have about yourself and your past and your experiences that you have coming into a new therapy situation, I think the more likely it is that you can find that fit, or you can figure out quickly that this is not a good fit. So
right. And that's valuable information too.
Yeah,
that's all part
absolutely.
of the journey. Yeah, that's a really good point, Kelsey. That's actually the first question that I try to ask on my consultation calls are, have you been in therapy before? What were some things that you like or didn't like about that therapist? Because then I can hopefully be able to say right away that that's not going to be a problem with me, or this is how I approach it, or, well, I actually kind of, I'm on the same page with your past therapist who wasn't a good fit. And so maybe, I can help refer you to somebody else instead. Thankfully that doesn't happen too often, but it could, and so if let's say that you have a therapist who says, you need to be more compassionate to the person who was abusing you, and you're like, no, I need to get out of here. And then you find another therapist and you bring that up, and they're like, yeah, he's right. You should be more. It's like, okay, next, let's go to the next one. Whatever it is, that's valuable information. And hopefully you can find someone who's a good fit for that approach. My bonus tip is about groups. Groups are often overlooked. It is a growing area of mental health support, I think it's safe to say. Research shows that for most people, support groups of some kind are just as effective as individual therapy, and it can be more cost effective for you and for the therapist. And there's this cool social dynamic. Just being with a group of people who are there to help one another is, as far as we know from research, healing in itself, on top of all the kind of practical, easy to understand stuff that you can get from a group. So don't discount groups. Consider whether or not it's something you're open to. And know that even though I'm not aware of a directory out there for groups like we were talking about with Psychology Today and others, that there are specific websites for all different kinds of groups that can help you find a group in your area for your specific need. So for someone who's interested in group support of some kind, there are many groups out there that are facilitated by a professional, a mental health professional. And a lot of peer support groups can be very powerful, as we know from a lot of 12-step programs, for example.
Yeah.
But, using Alcoholics Anonymous as an example, they have a whole directory on their website. And so if you're looking for that approach to addressing alcoholism, then that's definitely the easiest way to find something near you. And that's true for most specific types of group, whether it's grief or trauma or just kind of a general like relationships or a general therapy group. Just do some Googling, spend some time on Google or some other search engine, and set aside 10, 20, 30 minutes, and you'll probably come across something. So there are lots of resources out there, and you don't need to feel like you have to start with a totally blank slate as far as getting work done goes.
Yeah. I think one thing to keep in mind too is that, there's a lot of people out there who struggle with people pleasing. And so I can see how some people, they want to say the right things to please their therapist, but that's kind of one of the benefits of therapy is that you can kind of piss your therapist off, but they still have to talk to you now. They have to try and keep a professional relationship. And if that slips, then, you might need to find somebody new. But all this to say, the more honest that you can be with your therapist, the better. And so, for people who are skeptical of therapy, I remember when I was first taking on clients, I had one guy who came in and right away he said, does this really work? It doesn't really seem like this really works, but I'm forced to do this because such and such has told me that I need to do therapy. And, I was just honest with him and I was like, well, we'll see. But because he was honest with me and he wasn't just trying to say what I wanted to hear, we were able to, address it right away. And I was aware of it. He was aware of it. And there were multiple times where he said, actually, this is more helpful than I thought it would be. And I was like, okay, yep. But I think another thing too is if you are skeptical, if you have a lot of fear about starting therapy, if you're just not sure what to expect and you're, have some concerns, take it slow too. If you need to start out by seeing somebody once every other week or once a month, not to keep bringing up the same point, but what's the best kind of therapy? The therapy that you'll actually do. And so, if you coming into a therapy situation, and I think this can come with a little bit of doing some self-reflection and knowing what your needs are going into therapy. But if you know that you want to take it slow and you just got to dip your toes in a little bit and you're not ready to fully dive in, that's another thing that I would lead with a therapist is just telling them exactly where you are, because then all the chips are on the table and you know where you're going with it. So,
well said.
All right. So one last concept that we kind of wanted to cover. Some people are more familiar with different kinds of therapy than others. And so for somebody who is brand new to the concept or maybe has some negative experiences with other types of therapy, we thought it could just be helpful to kind of cover the major types of therapy, what they might look like, and what some of the best fits of people might be in those different categories. Just, help anybody. Some people who love research, will probably still do their own research, but some people who maybe don't have as much time to do as much of this research, we thought we'd just kind of give a little bit of a thumbnail of some of the different types of therapy. So, yeah.
Yeah. And one thing about this idea that I think is important to communicate, I know that we've compared therapists to doctors on a couple of occasions here, and I think this is one more important difference is that going to a doctor, medicine is medicine. They're basically going to be treating the same things similar ways.
Yeah.
But if you go from one therapist and then you go to another therapist, they might have a completely different way of seeing the whole thing and treating the whole thing. So that's good to keep in mind, just that there's a wide variety out there and you can use that to your advantage.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So there are really 4, at least if you take a college class about it, there are 4 major kind of categories that most of the major theories and approaches fall under. And so the first one is psychoanalytic, also known as psychodynamic. Those are 2 different things. Psychodynamic is kind of like the neo version of psychoanalytic. Psychoanalytic is the grandfather theory of therapy. For a while there, it was the only theory of therapy, the only approach. And so this is the sort of classical Sigmund Freud laying on a couch with a therapist behind you. Now, I don't want to paint it as entirely archaic because there are some really important concepts from it that have influenced basically all of therapy that has come after it. And so we owe a lot to Freud and psychoanalytic approach, and many people still practice it today. So a lot of it has to do, I would say the biggest word, if you want to think of psychoanalytic approach and psychodynamic approach as well, would be the unconscious. It's this idea that we have this whole world in our minds that we're not even aware of, and yet it affects our conscious mind. So it's about changing our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors by discovering unconscious meanings and motivation and bringing them into the conscious mind. And that is the basic theory in this approach of how healing takes place and change takes place. So moving on to the next major category is behavioral therapy. And the whole idea behind this is, hey, ultimately, I want to change the way that I'm living. I want to change the way that I'm talking and approaching different situations. And so I'm going to attack that directly. And so this, I would say, if you are more of a deterministic kind of person, understanding that we basically do what we were going to do all along based on our context and our history and our stimuli, then you'll probably really jive with this approach. And so talking about stimuli, rewards, and punishments, cause and effect. I don't know if it was during the podcast or before a podcast recently, but Kelsey said something to me or to me and Autumn at one point, and she snapped her wrist with a wristband. That was her using this type of therapy on herself. It was basically just teaching herself not to say that thing in that way. I don't even remember what it was at this moment, but that's a really basic example. Another major type of therapy that has come out of behavioral approach that has influenced many other types of approaches is desensitization. In other words, if you are afraid of something, if something really stresses you out, then to actually expose yourself to that thing step by step, little by little, in digestible doses. So it's kind of an overview of behavioral therapy. There are other types of therapy that fall under each one of these four major categories. The third one is cognitive therapy. And so instead of saying, hey, we would just want to change our behavior, let's stick with that, the cognitive people would say, no, really, we know that our thinking affects the way that we behave. And so the better approach is to attack our thinking, not attack, that's not the right word, but change. And so focus on that. It focuses entirely on thinking. And so you can imagine the types of interventions that come out of this, like, okay, if you're thinking this thing, then notice when you're thinking that, and instead think this other thing that is more rational. And if you can practice thinking in this way enough, then that will change your thinking patterns, that'll change your behavior. That's a really basic overview of it. And most people who are familiar with any approach to therapy have heard at least of cognitive behavioral therapy. So the last two categories we just covered are behavioral and cognitive. Cognitive behavioral therapy really integrates both, and it might be the most widely used approach in the field of mental health. I would say that a lot of people, like myself, I am not primarily a cognitive behavioral therapist, but I do use a lot of approaches and strategies from cognitive behavioral therapy. So it is structured, it is measured, it is the most research type of therapy, because every step of the way, basically, there's research to back it up that shows this works this many times with these types of people in this way. So if you're looking for something that has research behind it, cognitive behavioral therapy is probably for you. The last major category is humanistic therapy. And humanism, for those who don't know, is basically the belief that humans are sort of intrinsically good and beautiful, and that all that we need is within ourselves. And so that is kind of the overall philosophy to these types of therapies. Everything you need to change lies within you, waiting to be accessed. So client-centered therapy, or person-centered therapy, as its founder later called it, is about how the therapist really exists to be in relationship to the client, who is the true expert on their own lives and solutions. And Carl Rogers, who's a real hero to me and many others who are in the mental health field, he came up with basically the three things that are necessary and sufficient for change. That is for the therapist to have empathy and congruence, which you can think of like being authentic, and unconditional positive regard. No matter what you do or say, I can still see really the goodness in you, and I can hold you in a positive light. So that's what client-centered or person-centered therapy is about. Gestalt, or I think the correct pronunciation is Gestalt therapy. That overall is about the importance of focusing on the present. And so, of course, often our minds wander to the past or worrying about the future. And it's like, okay, so right now, what matters? Right now, how does that affect right now? And just keep coming back to the present. And also considering the context of relationships and culture. Gestalt therapy was really the first big one to say, hey, it's not just you in a vacuum. Let's look at your family. Let's look at your community. Not that others didn't talk about family, but it talks about how these larger groups that you're in the middle of can affect you right now, and brings that into the picture a lot. And the last one under humanistic is existential therapy. And so it's really similar to existential philosophy. It focuses on themes of free will and choice and searching for meaning. These are the major things that are explored in existential therapy. Once again, I'm oversimplifying every single one of these. All of these are much more complex and involved, and anybody who specializes or only practices one of these who listens to this, please don't get mad at me. Understand this is like the broadest possible overview.
He covered everything, and everyone has a master's degree now. Is what
Exactly. Yeah. Congratulations. And then the last one, the kind of bonus number 5, is integrative or eclectic or holistic, whatever term somebody wants to use, basically. And this covers, I would say, well over 60% of therapists out there, including myself. And that is, you take bits and pieces from lots of different theories and you put them together in a way that works for you. And it also has to do with kind of tailoring your therapeutic approach to the client and their needs. So with one client, I might use a more analytical, cognitive behavioral approach. With another, I might use a more intellectual, existential approach. Person-centered therapy is kind of underlying almost every session that I do. So, and another therapist is going to have a completely different way of integrating. So really an infinite number of combinations.
Yeah.
So there are several other of our favorite ones, or ones that are really popular in today's world of mental health that we wanted to go over as well.
Yeah. So the first one is DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy. This is one that Wes has said he doesn't have a ton of experience in, but person that I actually interned under in my master's program was a DBT therapist, and I, as part of my internship, was a part of a DBT group therapy group as well. And so it kind of breaks down. There's these things called diary cards or something like that, but really it's really skill based. And there are three different categories. Some of them, like one of them is emotion regulation. One of them is interpersonal skills. One of them, I don't really remember.
Stress, I think.
Yeah. And so they break down, these different skills into these kind of different categories, and they just go through and they teach these different skills that help you, if you can feel yourself becoming emotionally dysregulated, you go to your card and say, okay, this is a skill that I could use right now in this situation. And it's very practical. And I remember that was one of the things that I brought back with me is I really liked those cards, and I found them helpful personally, where when I was like, okay, I can feel myself getting emotionally dysregulated. And then I would look up and I'm like, oh, okay, this would be a helpful skill to practice in this time. And so it's a very, like I said, practical approach. It was created by somebody who had borderline personality disorder. And that's one of the main focuses of it. But it's practical for a lot of different people. So. Yeah,
and I think a lot of mindfulness, a lot of paying attention to your thoughts and feelings are involved.
Actually, that was one of the other categories, was mindfulness. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a few more big ones that I am a huge fan of, and that these are ones that, other than the last one, these are the ones that even before I knew they existed, when I came across them later on in my practice, I was like, oh yeah, I remember hearing about that in grad school. But even before I came across them later, I was like, I'm already doing this. Isn't this just kind of the way it is? So I really wanted to highlight these. Internal family systems. This is fantastic. It has a lot to do with acknowledging that we are not necessarily one constant self. I might have conflicting desires. I want to be healthy. Also, I want pizza, right? That is a super simple version of that. Both of those things are true about me, but it takes it to a way deeper and more helpful level. You acknowledge different parts, personalities, or families within you. That's where it gets its name, and how you feel about those different parts. And so one of the most, I think, easy to understand strategies from this is, for instance, anxiety and distress. That's a stress response. And if you think of that as a person or as a personality within you, then you can appreciate it and accept it and say, hey, I know that you're here to keep me safe. You're here to keep me alive. You're here to protect me from this thing that my brain is perceiving. But I don't want you to go away completely, because you do serve an important purpose. But instead of being in the driver's seat, I want you to sit in the passenger seat, or maybe in the back seat. And you can give me some directions, which I'll take into consideration, but I'm going to have my hand on the wheel. So that's one example. And all of these are so much more complex. It really pains me to give such a broad overview. But the parts have specific identities. You can treat them as individuals. And they're often faulty ways of coping with traumatic things that we've been through. So you identify parts of yourself also that you love, parts of yourself that you're proud of and that you want to draw from. So the next one is acceptance and commitment therapy. And it has a lot to do with, instead of hiding from or denying or avoiding certain thoughts and feelings, certain parts of your personality, you accept it as it is and just ask what it has to teach you. And you might have heard me use this kind of language in the podcast because this is so ingrained in me. It has to do with actually approaching your challenges and taking the parts of it that you can forward with you and learning how to manage it differently in other areas. It has to do with separating yourself from your thoughts or feelings. This one also has a lot of mindfulness influence. So a lot of us just kind of think that we exist in our own brains and that is who I am. But acceptance and commitment therapy from mindfulness says that I can think something and have it not be who I am. I can feel something and have it not be who I am. I am sort of the context for my thoughts, my feelings, my experiences. Being present, observing these things without judgment, And then the other big thing, it has to do with identifying what are my values, what's important to me, and how can I take realistic steps to kind of mold my life around my values so that I have a life that is meaningful to me, a life that lines up with what I believe is important. The next one, just a couple more, is narrative therapy. And just overall, lots of interesting and helpful concepts and strategies around seeing your life, seeing all of our lives. This one also takes larger groups of people into account. So seeing communities, ethnic groups, nations, the human race, seeing us as part of a story, part of a play. And again, lots of really interesting interventions having to do with that. And so I would encourage you to look into that more if that at all piques your interest. And the last one is one that I practice a lot. It's EMDR. And we went over it a little bit in another episode. But basically, the idea is that we all have been through things, and especially the influential things in childhood, that we carry with us that can affect our brains and the ways that we feel that we need to keep ourselves safe. And that can lead to what are known as mental health problems. And obviously, post-traumatic stress is the most direct example of that. But other problems that we have with living our lives can have to do with, I don't feel like the world is a safe place because of this thing that I've been through, or this thing that someone said to me that really cut to my core, and it's affected how I see myself. It has to do with identifying, okay, what's the memory that we're going to target here? And how does that make me feel about myself? Where does that feeling exist in my body? How do I think about myself as a result of this? And through a pretty structured process, engaging certain parts of your brain in both the left and right hemisphere, getting them to engage and talk to one another. And it kind of kickstarts the body's natural way of processing trauma. And so really the healing comes from within your own brain. It's like your brain kind of shuffles it in a way that may only make perfect sense to you, and that's okay. You can do EMDR and do very little talking at all. It's pretty amazing. So for those who don't like to talk, you might want to look into EMDR. The last overall concept I really wanted to mention is another way of looking at all of these is action-oriented versus insight-oriented. So some of these are more action-oriented, like practicing and role play and doing things kind of out in the wild between therapy sessions, keeping a journal, changing the way that you behave to change you as a person. And others are more insight-oriented. So they're more like those aha moments that you have in therapy through dialogue, through processing, through things. It's like, oh, now I see these things differently, and that's going to change the way that I live. So that's all that I've got about it.
Whew, all right. So that was sort of like drinking a psychology degree out of a fire hose there. There's a lot of information, but we really just want to do whatever we can to help people make the most well-informed decision that they can. Obviously, everyone is going to respond differently to different types of therapy. Each type is going to fit some better than it fits others. And, if you don't want to sit there with a box of tissues and talk about your feelings, but you really are just wanting some more practical steps to kind of work through in your life, CBT might be a better fit for you. But if you just kind of feel like nobody listens to you and you just kind of want to talk and you just need an empathetic ear, maybe that humanistic or that person-centered approach might be a little bit better fit for you. There are obviously, there's so many different types of therapy. And a big part of that is because there are just so many different types of people. And the other thing is, guess what? All of the types that Wes just talked about, they're all listed as filters on all 3 of the directories that Wes shared. As you were listening, if you're like, oh, that one kind of sounds interesting and that might be an approach I'd be interested in taking into therapy, keep that in mind when you're doing your search. But also if you were listening to some of them and you're like, ooh, that sounds kind of weird, or that just really doesn't make any sense to me. If you're kind of looking at a therapist and you see that approach to therapy listed on their info, you might want to consider other options. Really, we want to do anything that we can do to help people find that right fit quicker and with less wrong turns. Wrong turns are discouraging, and the more you know, the better chance you may have of finding that right fit the first time. But also to say, if you've tried therapy before and you didn't really find it helpful, well, chances are maybe their approach just didn't fit you, that well. And so there's a different kind of approach and a different therapist out there who can help you reach the goals that you want to address in your therapy. So like I said, that was a lot of info. So we're planning on putting together an infographic to kind of summarize it, and we'll try and get that out sometime this week. And you can have it just kind of as a reference point. And I also just wanted to say, like, if all of that was just a little overwhelming for you and you're like, oh my gosh, I feel like I know even less going into this, what I'm looking for, and that was just a lot of information and it didn't really help you, it actually just like made you feel even less prepared, that's okay. I will say, like, in all of the therapy situations that I went into, I didn't really know any of that. I wasn't going in with those approaches or those types in mind, and the majority of the therapeutic experiences that I've had have been very helpful and very positive. So even if you just don't really know, it's okay. That's okay. The biggest thing, like I said at the end of my tips, is to just do it. The hardest part of therapy, or at least one of the hardest parts of therapy, is starting. And so, as we shared, I think in our first episode about therapy, the best thing about therapy is that it works. The majority of people find it helpful. So whether you feel like you have an exact idea of what your goal is going into therapy, or whether you still feel like you don't really know, you just want to see what it's like, or just try it. Just try it. Start. Take that next tiptoe forward, because honestly, what do you have to lose? And there's a lot that you could gain. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, are we ready for our outro question?
I guess so.
Okay. Here is your question, your kind of reflection question to take with you. If you were to look for a new therapist, what would be the top 3 priorities that you would look for? So whether maybe you're seeing a therapist now who you're happy with, maybe you have no interest in working with a therapist, maybe you're somewhere in between, but this can still be kind of an interesting and helpful thought experiment that shouldn't take too much of your time. So go ahead and give it a try. What would be your top 3 priorities if you were to look for a new therapist this week?
Great. All right. Well, hopefully you will found some stuff in this that was helpful for you to at least kind of think through or think about, whether it's for you or whether it's a friend or a family member. But that kind of wraps us up for today. So be sure to look for us on social media. So first of all, we have facebook.com/emh.nsc. And then our Instagram handle is @embrace.mental.health. And you can always email us at embracementalhealthnsc@gmail.com. So yeah, we're definitely looking to hear back from you guys and also to keep you informed. Autumn does an awesome job with our social media and keeps a lot of updates and just kind of little reminders throughout the week. And yeah, we would love to hear back from people too. So
yeah.
Happy Mental Health Monday.
Thanks for listening. Yeah.
Yep.
Talk to you next week.